Hello and welcome to this screencast on Horace's Ode 1.12. I'm doing this as part of a series from the Classical Studies, AS Classical Studies, on the Romans section of the course for paper 2. And we're not so much looking at Horace's poem in terms of what it is as literature, but rather what we can get from it in terms of understanding the way that Augustus's power worked, the way that ideology was propagated through literature and through the visual arts. Okay, so beginning with the ode itself, it's a Pindaric ode borrowed from the Greeks. It is very significant because it is thought to celebrate the marriage of Marcellus and Augustus's only daughter, Julia, in around about 25 BCE. But it's very much a panegyric poem to Augustus and his power. And really what we can see here is Horace really urgently and desperately insisting upon the remarkable nature of Augustus, both as a man and as a ruler. Now it begins by calling out to the gods. What man, what hero, Clio sweet, on harp or flute will thou proclaim? Now the Clio that he's referring to here is the muse, one of the 9 muses, and she is thought to be the muse of history. He's also going to be using a great deal of references to Orpheus. Orpheus was the Greek hero. I have a picture of him here with Eurydice, who was his lover, who died and went to the underworld, was the great musician. So immediately, Horace is setting himself the problem of asking, how can we capture the greatness of this person? And he goes on to say, what god shall Echo's voice repeat in mocking game? This is, of course, a reference to a Greek myth for the origins of Echo. And then he goes on to talk about to Helicon's sequined shade, and here Helicon refers to 2 sacred rivers that were thought to be the place where the muses were resident. And he goes on to say, or Pindus, or on Haemus's chill. These are both Greek mountains, again, very much associated with this idea of the muses. And then he goes on to talk about the minstrel's will, which again is a reference to Orpheus, the greatest musician of all time. And he also goes on to say, who by his mother's gift of song, his mother is Calliope, who was the muse of music, held the fleet stream, the rapid breeze. Now this is very typical conceit used by classical poets to call upon the muses or to ask for inspiration. It's part of the epic mode to show how great the person is that he's trying to describe and what an effort it will take, what a creative effort it will take to try to capture the incredible grandness of this. Now that in itself is really interesting because we see literature here operating on the level of propaganda. We know that Maecenas, who's a very close friend of Augustus by this stage, had a little stable of court poets, and that they would celebrate Augustus's virtue, his prowess on the battlefield, and all of the achievements that he is seen as being responsible for. Now there's a pattern to this particular ode, and it begins with the greatest, the gods. Whom shall we praise first? The sire on high. Now this is quite interesting because we will see that Zeus or Jove is the sire on high. And down below is our all-powerful Princeps, Augustus. And Horace goes on to say, who gods and men unerring guides, who rules the sea, the earth, the sky, their times and tides. So we get a sense of this omnipotence of Jove above, and then we move on to talk about other gods. Here is Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. Here is Bacchus, the god of wine and of song and dance. And finally, Phoebus, Apollo, And let's not forget that at this time, Augustus was building the Temple of Apollo, one of the great temples that he constructs on the Palatine Hill. So these gods are listed, and there's this pattern to this poem. The next stage, of course, is the demigods. Here we have Alcides, which is another name for Heracles. Next we have Leda's twins. Leda was a beautiful earthly woman who Zeus fell in love with and approached as a swan and impregnated her, and she gave birth to Castor and Pollux, two demigods. And so we have this movement then from the gods to the demigods, and then we have the movement to the earthly heroes. Of course, they're going to be centered around Rome. We have Quirinus, which is a name for Romulus. We have Numa, who was the successor to Romulus, who was known for being very religious. And then we have proud Tarquin. He was the final king of Rome, and you will recall that after the rape, he was exiled or killed, whichever version of the story you want to go with, followed by, interestingly enough, Cato, stern Cato, he calls him, who was the great Republican who actually defied Julius Caesar and took his own life rather than live under a kind of Caesarian regime, which is kind of an interesting choice. Then he goes on to talk about Regulus, Abscarian, Paulus, Cani, etc., Furius, Fabricius. Now, these are not people that are really part of our course, but what's very interesting is that it sets this idea of lineage, and a noble lineage. Now, in medieval political theory, they believed in a chain of being, going from God to angels, to kings, to lords, all the way down to vassals, peasants like us. And there's something really a little bit similar with this. When we study the Aeneid, we will find that when they go into the underworld, they discover in book 6, they discover what they call the pageant of the heroes. This is a line of the most extraordinary Romans, and it's something that we also find in terms of statues. Augustus is going to complete the Augustan Forum much later, and in the Augustan Forum there are these amazing lines of statues. So this is part of the idea of making Romans very proud of their history. But also we will notice that Augustus always does very well out of these lines of people. You may recall that Mark Antony laughed at his lineage and called him the son of a baker, and said that his father had kind of contemptible lineage. So he mocked his parentage. Now what the poets are going to do is they will rewrite Augustus's lineage so that it becomes absolutely glorious, and as you can see, quite divine. We will see in the many of the statues and many of the poems that he's related to various gods like Venus, like Apollo, etc. So this places us with this extraordinary history we see. And if we move over, so we're asking ourselves in this poem, where do we put Augustus next to these gods, these demigods, and these extraordinary heroic people, these extraordinary heroic Romans? And then we move, there's a volta in the poem where it changes, and it goes to Marcellus. So let's not forget that this is Marcellus and Julia. Julia is Augustus's daughter. It's their wedding, but it's not really addressed to their wedding or their nuptials or their fertility or their love. It is a panegyric to the great Augustus. And he says here, Marcellus's fame, its upgrowth hid, springs like a tree, great Julius's light. So it's interesting here because it appears as though it's going to address Marcellus, but immediately it deflects to the great Julius Caesar. And this appears to be an allusion to the comet, to Julius Caesar's comet, which was a sign that Augustus believed that Julius had become a god, and that the comet was a sign of his soul ascending to heaven. We know that this was absolutely integral to Octavian's rise to power. And this was the whole idea of divi filius. Here we see the denarius that was struck in 44 BCE, and it was struck in the wake of this extraordinary comet, and here we see the comet. So we know that this was a wonderful piece of propaganda, that Octavian really favored this piece of propaganda because rather than being a god himself, it meant that he was son of a god. And here in the poem, we see the same metaphor. Great Julius's light shines like the radiant moon amid the lamps of the night. So, rather than this being about Marcellus, it goes back to this propaganda point of what an extraordinary line the Caesarians are. And let's not forget as well that Marcellus at this point is becoming the favoured successor to Augustus. Suetonius tells us that Agrippa went away in a huff because Marcellus was taking his place. Interestingly enough, when it actually came to the real succession, when Augustus thought he was dying in 23 BCE, he gives his signet ring to Agrippa and not to Marcellus, which is very interesting. But what it does show is there seems to be plans for succession. Now remember that this was always a thorny issue for Augustus. He certainly has solidified power himself. But how will he pass this power on? Well, it appears that one of the ways that he's going to do this is through auctoritas, through making Marcellus a great figure in terms of literature. And so this is an important moment in terms of seeing how soft power in the Principate worked. And the real importance of Maecenas, who's working in the background, making sure that all the poets and the historians and the writers and the sculptors are working to solidify the power of Augustus. And now, on to the next verse. Dread sire and guardian of man's race. So again, we're talking about above. To thee, O Jove, the fates assign. So here Jove is given the power he deserves. He's the legitimate leader. Our Caesar's charge, his power and place next to thine. Now look at the beautiful symmetry there. We could call this a kind of chiasmus. Above, we have Jove, the rightful leader, who is reigning with legitimacy, his place secure. And below him, in perfect symmetry, is his kind of son, who is, of course, Augustus Caesar. Now, in medieval king theory in Europe, we have the idea of the divine right, that the king is essentially God's anointed representative on earth. And that seems to be what's happening here. There's a kind of perfect unity between heaven and earth. And the message of the poem is clearly that Augustus is ruling with the full support of Jove and the gods and the entire cosmos. That this is what was meant to be. This was the proper kind of chain of being, as it comes to be called later. And then we move on to something which is very interesting that we'll find in Res Gestae, and that you will recall from the Prima Porta statue, the breastplate in particular, where we have the standards of Rome, and we have a very contrite Parthian leader supplicating himself and giving these standards to what appears to be Tiberius here, that is clearly representative of the fact that the great Augustus has cowed these Parthians. Now, don't forget, they didn't actually beat the Parthians in battle. They were beaten, both Crassus and Mark Antony on 2 occasions were beaten by the Parthians and lost these standards. But in terms of art, the Parthians are the losers and Augustus is the victor. So what do we see here? We see how poetry is working alongside things like the Prima Porta and to Res Gestae, where the whole incident of the return of the standards is framed as a military victory, and Horace seems to be supporting that here. Let's not forget that John Dryden called Horace a court slave and absolutely despised his poetry and believed him to be a sort of sycophantic supporter of the Augustan regime. So here the Parthians, his eagles scatter to the wind, and the eagles here being an allusion to the standards and to the fact that Augustus's power is so great that he makes them scatter to the wind or follow to their eastern home. And here we have the reinforcement of Orientalism, which is something that Edward Said says exists across the West after this idea that the East is a bit corrupt. And here the Parthians are being forced home, taken out of the Occidental world and being imprisoned back in their realm. And you'll notice here is a reference to Cathay, China, and India. Now that once again directly refers to what we're told in Res Gestae, where the imperial ambitions of Rome are so extraordinary that even ambassadors from India come and supplicate themselves to the great Augustus, and to this patriotic pride, the sense that Rome is now an extraordinary empire and that it really has cowed all opposition, and that is thanks to the rule of Augustus. Notice again that Augustus, thy second, of course here he's saying, dear sire, here he's referring to thy second, and thy second is, of course, Augustus. Let him rule below. Interesting. Now, it really does seem to me that this is the ideology of monarchy. This is no longer the republic. It's a real naked support for the idea that Augustus is ruling by divine right. There's absolutely no mention of the Senate here or any of Mommsen's diarchy or anything like this. This is definitely sovereign-style rule with the imprint of the gods, the seal of the gods. And he says here, thy car, thy chariot shall shake the realms above. Thy vengeful bolt shall overthrow each guilty grove. So it's a very militaristic coda finish to the poem, isn't it? Where Zeus is above throwing his thunderbolts, making sure that everyone is absolutely terrified of him, ruling without any kind of opposition. And it seems to me implicit here that this is a kind of real endorsement of an authoritarian ruler here. So it's interesting because it's a much more of a mask-off moment than Res Gestae, which is constantly making out as though there's perfect harmony between the Senate and Augustus. Here, Augustus is a godlike being, and the poet has strived to capture his greatness. He's gone through gods and demigods to the greatest rulers and heroes of Rome, and he ends by only being able to sort of see Augustus as the second greatest ruler to Jove. So an extraordinary piece of propaganda, very useful, I think, when you're doing essays on the nature and ideology of the Principate and how the arts worked to reinforce this idea that Augustus was the legitimate ruler, the ruler of auctoritas. I hope that was useful. Thank you.